Listen, I don't like to give myself too much credit for a lot of things because I do get a lot of things wrong, and I'm definitely far from humble. So if I start patting myself on the back too much, I'm afraid if I give myself an inch, I'll take a mile. And nobody wants to see Nick in his cocky boy era. However, one thing that I do have to pat myself on the back on is the fact that as a YouTube page that talks a lot about JJK, I have not once made a video talking about whether or not Gojo is gonna come back from the dead. And Gojo lost his battle against Sukuna like over 2 months ago, and I talked two things very well: JJK and theories. So me staying away from the hot iron that was Gojo is coming back to life theories has been fairly difficult, but not as difficult as one would assume, because genuinely, I don't think he's coming back, especially with the way that the manga is currently going, as Higuruma and Itadori are currently engaged in combat against Sukuna, in a way that's not only going to allow Yuji to air all of his grievances against Sukuna, but also possibly be the person to deal the killing blow with the Executioner's Blade. And to me, if Gojo comes back to life, one, it cheapens the moment of taking him out in his battle against Sukuna, and two, is he just going to wrap up the story for everybody else? But that doesn't mean that I haven't been reading or watching these theories that people formulate in order to figure out just how we're going to get our glorious blue-eyed king back. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I enjoy the fact that Gojo died. He was one of my favorite characters. The further away I get from his bisecting, temporally that is, the more I realize it's one of the most villainous things that a mangaka has ever done, and I kind of love it. And therefore, well, it would be cool to see Gojo back with everybody, yucking it up, hanging out with his friends. I believe that if Gojo were to be brought back to life, it would cheapen the plot. So I'll admit, when I read or watch these theories on people speculating how Gojo is going to come back to life, I'll admit I view them through the lens of, oh, this person's taken a big old hit of copium. And usually they are. I mean, we got people pulling in Buddhist ideology here, using numerology from ancient Buddhist texts to say that Gojo, as the enlightened one, is going to take 7 steps to re-enlighten himself just because Buddha took 7 steps north, and so on and so forth. I mean, holy God, there's a lot of justification and a whole lot of copium. But it is genuinely fun to engage in these kind of thinking exercises. I mean, it's literally what I do for a job. And trying to find the strings between certain logical points that you're trying to create in order to build out a theory in an anime universe is genuinely one of my favorite things of all time. So who am I to judge? Now, the reason that I'm giving you all this context and giving myself a somewhat self-congratulatory pat on the back is because just yesterday, one of my friends, Big Mike on TikTok, sent me a theory that's making its way around Twitter to the tune of 1.2 million views. And this theory, outside of being just so ridiculously long, is probably the best theory I've seen for Gojo's possible return to the manga. And thus today, I want to talk about this theory. More specifically, I want to talk about the parts of this theory that I believe in and the parts of this theory that I believe are massive stretches. And then at the conclusion of today's video, I want to talk about whether or not I believe this theory is a possibility and if it fits into the plot that I believe that Gege is trying to build. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, because now, for the first time in the history of the Weeb Commander, we're talking, is Gojo coming back to life? Before we get to speculating about our glorious king's return, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see two glorious kings talk about anime on a weekly basis, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you just want to dress like a glorious king yourself, go ahead and meander into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. No Twitter, basically the only place on earth that gives Reddit a run for its money when it comes to half-baked anime theories. And unfortunately, even though I don't have a professional Twitter myself, I find myself trolling Twitter quite often to try and find content for videos like this. And I guess I do the exact same thing with Reddit. But surprisingly, when you build up an audience of almost 1 million people who look at you as an anime encyclopedia / professional theorist, usually I don't even have to do the searching. Because if anybody who either has my phone number, the ability to DM me, or send me an email stumbles upon a theory that they believe I would find interesting, it finds a way to me. And that is exactly what happened yesterday, November 30th, when my fellow 6'5" former college lineman friend, Big Mike, you don't believe me? Just kidding, I played running back, and not well. And this theory, with 1.2 million views, was posted by the Twitter user Big Daddy Gojo. So, there might be, or probably almost definitely some biases, but I do have to give some props to Big Daddy Gojo here, because amongst all of the Gojo is still alive theories that I've seen, this one does a really good job of substantiating key points, backing them up with evidence, and filling out the theory by connecting the strings. But considering the fact that this theory is longer than War and Peace, I guess they had a lot of time to figure that out. And I kind of have a soft spot for this theory because this theory started in a way that I've started a ton of my theories, and that is by noticing one small detail and building out from there. Minato and Tsunade's hair colors are somewhat similar. Let's see if we can make a connection between the two of them and see if they would be related in any way. Kakashi is said to have a better nose than Kiba, a member of the Inuzuka clan. Is Kakashi somehow tangentially connected to the Inuzuka clan? And so on and so forth. Starting from a humble beginning and finding data to substantiate your theory is one of the funnest things you can do as a content creator or really just a casual anime enjoyer. It makes you feel like Indiana Jones trying to find treasure without all the answers. So while there are definitely some moments throughout this theory that either make no sense or are complete and total copium, I still want to go over it with you today. So with no further ado, let's get into Big Daddy Gojo's theory about how Gojo will return. See, the humble beginning for this theory starts with a music video. Yes, a music video. Specifically a music video that came out about 8 days ago by Weeb, the people who did the first opening for JJK. Now the song is called Avant, and while I don't technically believe it's been in any JJK season, the entire music video is filled with JJK symbology, as basically the entirety of the music video is one long reference to a bunch of things that have happened throughout JJK's anime and manga. Now unfortunately, if you want to pick up on what the majority of those symbols and references are, you need a doctorate in JJK. But fortunately, the poster of this theory and I both do have doctorates in all things JJK. So while I definitely didn't pick up on as many of the symbols as Big Daddy Gojo, I picked up on a couple that they actually might have missed. But Big Daddy Gojo starts going on about how Avant, the music video, only contained canon references, which I don't necessarily understand, because the references aren't really anything. And also, there's not really any non-canon JJK content. So what could they reference outside of the canon? So them opening by fully in capitals writing the word canon a bunch was confusing. And it was also slightly unsettling, because the more a theory says the word canon, the higher possibility that it's built on nothing. However, Big Daddy Gojo does go on to say that all of the references made throughout this music video were tied into actual things that have happened in the anime or the manga, except for one thing, and that one thing is what the entirety of this theory is based off. Big Daddy Gojo then goes on to list every single canon reference made in this music video, like the fact that the prison realm is shown a couple times, there's a bunch of Sukuna's fingers, there's Yuta's ring, and so on and so forth. There's a ton of JJK references. It's fairly obvious. One of the cooler and more glaring references made throughout Avant is that we see a fish cut in half. And this fish has 6 eyes. Now this fish is obviously Gojo, and the reason that this fish is being shown is because in the beginning of Sukuna and Gojo's battle, Sukuna calls Gojo a nameless fish, is at least what Big Daddy Gojo tells us here. But what Big Daddy Gojo fails to realize early on in this theory is that the fish doesn't have 6 eyes. It has 5. But I guess you could make the argument that the 6th eye is on the other side of the fish because fish can only lay on their sides. What I do find interesting though is that Big Daddy Gojo doesn't realize that as we're cutting away from this fish, a nail pierces one of its 5 and or 6 eyes. More specifically, a nail pierces its biggest eye, which I found incredibly interesting, and it actually might corroborate the theory that we're going to be talking about today, but we'll come back to that in a second. But before I can talk about how this nail to Gojo's eye might actually corroborate this theory, it does bring up a greater point about the continuity of this theory, as Big Daddy Gojo multiple times says that the entire rest of the music video makes sense except for the one instance that we're going to focus on. That is to say that you can tie every single reference seen throughout this music video to something that has happened in either the anime or the manga, meaning that the only thing that is unexplainable throughout the entirety of this music video is the one event that this theory is spun out of, which we should stop beating around. What is this one instance in this music video that created this incredibly long and well fleshed out theory? Well, at the 1 minute 24 second mark, a portrait of Gojo's eyes is brought onto screen. And as this portrait of Gojo's eyes is brought onto the screen, in the foreground of the picture, I guess, are a bunch of chains going across the screen. Now, we know these are Gojo's eyes because 1, who else in JJK's eyes would we focus on? And 2, because in these eyes, we can see the reflection of the sky, and therefore this is supposed to be a reference to Gojo's awakening in his battle against Toji. Now, outside of the chains in the foreground, something else weird happens with Gojo's eyes. And that is, just as the portrait of Gojo's eyes is about to disappear, a black splotch is thrown over his left eye, which is weird because Gojo never lost an eye, so why are we blacking out one of his eyes? So because of the symbology of the chains in the foreground and the black splotch over the left eye, Big Daddy Gojo comes to the realization that there's a possibility that Gojo makes a binding vow with himself, as usually the only thing that chains are tied to in JJK are binding vows. And since the next portrait is a hand holding a 500 yen coin, which is meant to symbolize Mei Mei and her love for money and how she'll do anything for money, like leaving other sorcerers behind to flee to Malaysia, in the foreground of that portrait we see crow's feathers fallen. And since Mei Mei's curse technique entirely revolves around crows, it becomes clear that whatever put in the foreground of these portraits is meant to tie in to the person in said portrait. So why did Gojo have chains? Well, Big Daddy Gojo believes that Gojo makes a binding vow with himself while on death's door to sacrifice one of his 6 eyes in order to save his own life. And thus this is why we see the chains and the black splotch over one of Gojo's eyes. And honestly, I do see the logic here, because Big Daddy Gojo points out that in Season 1, when Sukuna is telling Yuji all about binding vows, while Sukuna is telling Yuji about the binding vow that they're locking into, the chains move across the screen in a way very similar to what we see in the music video. And thus when it comes down to it, yes, absolutely, chains are usually associated with binding vows in JJK. And we've never seen Gojo make a binding vow. So it's a possibility that the binding vow being referenced in this music video hasn't happened yet. Now the poster goes on to speculate about what this binding vow could mean for Gojo. And they speculate that Gojo will give up one of his 6 eyes to continue living at the expense of either A, B, or C. 3 possible options. Option A being that Gojo gets to keep on living with the sacrifice of one of his eyes, but he's unable to use cursed energy at all. I think this is a possibility is weird. See, I understand that it is definitely a possibility that Gojo would be able to give up one of his eyes and the usage of cursed energy, and that would give him such a boost of temporary cursed energy that it would allow him to bring himself back to life from basically anything. But Gojo could probably just make a binding vow that says he would never use cursed energy again, or just give up the usage of cursed energy, and that would be enough to bring him back. So I genuinely don't really know how the eye would play into that. I like option B even less, as option B says that Gojo is able to use cursed energy in combat, but not his cursed technique, because while the 6 eyes are incredibly crucial in making sure that Gojo can use his cursed technique at the level that he can, it's not like without his 6 eyes he wouldn't still be able to use the Limitless. As we know, for multiple generations there has either been people in the Gojo clan born with the Limitless or the 6 eyes, and it's just in the Gojo clan when somebody is born with both that they're incredibly broken. And I can't for the life of me figure out why Gojo losing one of the 6 eyes would stop him from using cursed techniques. I mean, obviously we've seen people like Todo lose their cursed technique by losing a hand, but this is mostly because Todo's technique was contingent on him clapping his hands together. Nothing about the 6 eyes has ever said that you need both of the 6 eyes to continue using the 6 eyes and use the 6 eyes to make the Limitless as good as it is. At least as good as it is for Gojo. So I'm not a big fan of this possibility either. And I gotta say that C is probably my favorite possibility, but not really one that I love. As C says that giving up one of his eyes would give him a temporary boost to his cursed energy, his cursed technique, his reverse cursed technique. But when that boost is over, he'll no longer be able to use the 6 eyes, Limitless, or any cursed energy whatsoever. Kind of like Gon in the end of the Chimera Ant arc, giving up the entirety of his power for the rest of his life for power in that one moment. Now I don't hate this, because within the confines of a binding vow, that would make sense as a result. Temporary boost that resolves in a handicap down the line. But if I were to write an option D here, I would say if Gojo was to give up one of his eyes in order to bring himself back to life, Gojo would be giving up half of his power. Let's say hypothetically you do need both of the 6 eyes to operate at 100% function. That wouldn't be crazy. I mean, it lines up with basically everything we know about anime and manga. You lose one of your Sharingan, you're half as powerful. You have both the Rinnegan, you're double as powerful, so on and so forth. Having more special eyes is never a bad thing. So if I were to put down an option D here, I would say that Gojo would make a binding vow to give up one of his 6 eyes to get enough energy to fix his body, at the cost that when he comes back, he'll only be able to use the 6 eyes in the Limitless at half capacity. And thus you save Gojo's life, but he doesn't become a plot device again. Half power Gojo is still probably one of the more powerful sorcerers on Earth. He's not the plot device that he was previously, which kind of seems like a win plot-wise and a win for the fandom. So while we do disagree in the possibility of Gojo using a binding vow to lose one of his eyes, I do agree with Big Daddy Gojo that it might be a possibility, especially because, as Big Daddy Gojo points out multiple times throughout the anime and manga, Gojo is shown with one eye, as there's moments where pictures of Gojo will shatter over his left eye. In one of the comedic 0.5 manga chapters, there's a moment where Gojo has one big eyeball on his eye cover that makes him look like a cyclops, and pretty much every single time Gojo ever lifted his eye band, he only ever revealed one eye. Now, people in the comments to this tweet said that the left eye in Buddhism symbolizes the beginning, or like new beginnings, but I don't think that's true. And if it is true, boy oh boy, could I find absolutely no evidence to corroborate it. As in Buddhist symbology, the eyes are a very important thing, but only as they pertain to Buddha. As eyes of the Buddha are something that you'll see painted all throughout Asia, the eyes of Buddha are meant to symbolize his all-knowing omnipotence. And therefore his eyes being painted everywhere is to show Buddhists that Buddha is everywhere. So yeah, not entirely sure where they're getting that left eye thing. Also, after this, tweet goes on to say that there's more symbology tied between Gojo and his left eye, because when Gojo uses his last hollow purple, his right eye is blacked out, which I guess puts focus on his left eye. But why would his left eye be blacked out in the music video and his right eye be blacked out as he did his last hollow purple against Sukuna? Now, the tweet says that his left eye is blacked out during his last hollow purple, but it's not. It's his right eye, like, for sure. So there's a couple of holes beginning to show themselves. But the theory does get back on track when the poster starts to talk about what happened in chapter 244. Specifically when the coalition of sorcerers against Kenjaku and Sukuna were drafting up a plan on how to defeat Sukuna and Kenjaku in the event of Gojo's defeat. While Kusakabe was drafting up an idea on how to defeat Sukuna and who to send in after Gojo's inevitable death, Hashimo says, "It's all out war. Why don't we all just jump in and try to kill Sukuna?" Which Kusakabe responds and says, well, not all of us can generate an opening or even be helpful in a battle against Sukuna. Like our friend Miwa here, who apparently made a binding vow in Shibuya to put all of the energy that she had for the rest of her life into a katana swing to try and cut Kenjaku down. But the binding vow that she made with this katana meant that after she put all of her energy into this swing, she could never pick up a katana again. Now, objectively, adding this into chapter 244 was odd. Because one, who gives a shit? It's Miwa. And two, even if we did give a shit about Miwa, why is Kusakabe calling her out in the middle of this meeting? So the post goes on to speculate that the reason that we're showing the fact that Miwa gave everything up for one final swing and is therefore no longer able to use a katana is to draw a connection between the possibility of Gojo giving up one of his eyes in order to lose the usage of cursed energy. That is to say that this post is speculating that Gojo undergoes a similar binding vow to the one that Miwa underwent in the Shibuya incident. The post goes on to say that about halfway between Gojo and Sukuna's battle, Sukuna thinks to himself about how Gojo's hollow purple is operating at about 120% power with the aid of some kind of binding vow. And during the duration of this battle and all time prior to this battle, we have never seen Gojo make a binding vow to increase his cursed energy output. But unfortunately, it doesn't really need to be Gojo, because if we remember correctly, at the beginning of the battle between Gojo and Sukuna, it's revealed that Gojo brings two people with him to the battle against Sukuna, which is weird, right? Because it's supposed to be a one-on-one, and it is. However, Gojo brings two people that will be able to buff him in his battle against Sukuna. And those two people are Utahime and the Kyoto Jujutsu High Principal. Now, the reason that he brings these two people is because Utahime has a curse technique known as Solo Forbidden Area, which allows her to do a dance that increases her curse energy and output, and the curse energy and output of one selected sorcerer within her range. And what is the boost that they receive? Well, their curse energy and output is increased to 120%. However, in order for Utahime to use this incredibly powerful curse technique, she can't leave anything out, which means that she needs to chant, do gestures, dance, and have music, which is why the Kyoto Principal is here. And just the couple of panels after that, it says that Gojo, much like Utahime, also leaves nothing out, which is why Gojo does his 9 ropes polarized light chant that allows him to make his hollow purple 200% stronger. So to me, in that moment, it seems entirely more likely that we're talking about Utahime's Solar Forbidden Area, or the fact that Gojo can use his chants to increase the power of his hollow purple. But then again, I could just be a Debbie Downer. But Big Daddy Gojo is correct here. Miwa being singled out as a sorcerer who gave everything they possibly had into one attack at the loss of their cursed energy or at the loss of their cursed technique was odd, and that chapter coming out around the time of this music video is coincidental. Now, where I don't ride with Big Daddy Gojo here is that Big Daddy Gojo then starts to make connections between Gojo and Miwa in order to strengthen the idea that Gojo would use a binding vow like Miwa's. And those points are as follows. Miwa was always very kind to him. She was one of the only characters that don't appear to be annoyed by Gojo. It's a bit thin, but I'm sure the other points are good, right? The second point is Miwa's the first person we see using Simple Domain in the series, and we see Gojo use it for the first time since childhood against Sukuna out of the blue. Out of the blue is weird wording there, because it's not out of the blue. It was the right thing to do in the moment. The reason that Gojo uses Simple Domain against Sukuna is because he loses in a battle of domains against Sukuna, and therefore he's being sliced and diced to death because he's being hit by the sure hit factor of Malevolent Shrine. And Gojo hasn't adapted to cleave and dismantle like Maharaga. And what's the one ironclad rule of a domain expansion war if you get caught in somebody's domain expansion without the ability to use your own? You use a simple domain to nullify the sure hit factor. So out of the blue is weird wording there. But the third and final detail to grow a connection between Gojo and Miwa is when Gojo is asked what his kind of woman is, he says Miwa, which is weird because he's a teacher and she's a student. But who knows? Maybe he was just talking about how they're super similar and both like to use binding vows to get rid of their cursed energy in order to keep on living. But there's also the fact that this was done in a Juju scroll after one of the episodes in season 1. So treating it as canon material to try and buff out a theory isn't our best idea. But the core of the argument is not bad. It's clear and obvious that sorcerers have the ability to give up cursed energy in order to save their own lives, or in order to unleash an incredibly powerful attack, like Gon at the end of the Chimera Antar. And that was proven to us in this most recent chapter by a kind of weird call out of Miwa. So there is definitely a possibility that that was called out in order to give credence to the idea that Gojo himself could be using a binding vow. Which brings us to the conclusion of this theory, which is perplexing. See, Big Daddy Gojo goes on to say that all of this theory circles back to Gojo and Geto splitting up after the hidden inventory arc. And most importantly, it all comes back to when Geto asks Gojo, are you the strongest because you're Gojo, or are you Gojo because you're the strongest? Now, in this scene, there's a particular focus paid to Gojo's right eye, which also feels kind of like a stretch, because the way that the scene plays out is that Gojo and Geto are both on a sidewalk, and it's like the camera or the person drawing the story is in the street, so we're seeing them from the side. And so it's not like the camera or the manga ever panels over and we just see one half of Gojo's face. It's just that Gojo is standing like this. So saying that this scene is paying particular attention to Gojo's right eye, the side that is darkened when he's using his final hollow purple, once again, kind of a stretch. Now, the poster says that this scene right here, Gojo and Geto's final goodbye, is actually a setup for the day that Gojo would lose one of his eyes and no longer be the strongest. And Gojo would lose his title of strongest by losing one of his 6 eyes and possibly losing access to his cursed energy or his cursed technique. And through Gojo no longer being one of the strongest, the narrative theme that runs throughout the entirety of JJK, that is eventually that this new generation of Yuji, Megumi, Nobara, and the rest of the high schoolers will eventually surpass Gojo, would truly come to be. The post goes on to say that Gojo wouldn't mind losing his powers if it meant that the next generation could rise up to be stronger than him. But I have one small problem with this narrative choice. See, if hypothetically Gojo does want the next generation to rise up and be stronger than him, why does he need to be alive, especially if he doesn't have cursed energy? I mean, whether he comes back to life with no cursed energy or no cursed technique, or if he just stays dead, the next generation is already more powerful than him. I mean, I guess he could kind of be put in All Might's shoes, where he was once the most powerful person on Earth and now he's a teacher with none of those powers, but it's a bit late in the story for Gojo to be a teacher to anyone. We're like a half a year to a year away from the ending of JJK. Kenjaku doesn't have a head and Sukuna's battling against Yuji. Like, we're close to the end. Now, if you wanted to make the argument for my possible ending, the ending where Gojo comes back with half of his power, then I guess, yeah, him coming back to life with half of his power and realizing that the generation that he raised is now more powerful than him would kind of play into the narrative through line of JJK, but him coming back with no cursed technique and cursed energy doesn't really accomplish anything. It just brings him back to life. After this, admittedly, some yapping happens. I'm gonna speed run through it because it's pretty heavy copium. I'm gonna read it directly here. Back when Chozo and Yuki faced Kenjaku, Yuki said to Chozo right before death, "You died today as a curse. Now go on and live as a human," which is essentially Yuki as she's dying in a battle against Kenjaku telling Chozo to go on living because he switched sides from the cursed spirits to the humans. And I guess the tie-in here is that Gojo would go from the strongest to just a dude, but I don't really know what that has to do with Yuki and or Choso. The tweet goes on to say, and when Sukuna faced Gojo, he said to Gojo, "Goodbye, the strongest," calls him mediocre, and attempts to expand his domain. But fans learned in the true Japanese language, Sukuna actually used the word for unenlightened. The tweet then continues, Sukuna literally did kill, or almost kill, the strongest, but his binding vow allows him to return as Satoru Gojo. Gojo thought he was the honored/enlightened one in hidden inventory, but this is when Gojo will attain his true enlightenment, which is letting go of his ego and his powers, and he will choose to come back to the world as Gojo Satoru rather than the strongest. Now, I don't hate that narratively, the idea of Gojo's true enlightenment being that he's not the strongest. And now, after realizing that he is no longer the strongest, he can live as a human, truly enlightened and free of the burden that was being the strongest person on Earth, because there's a lot of responsibility in being a plot device. But one could absolutely make the argument that Gojo has already gone through this second enlightenment. And in fact, the airport scene that happened after his death is meant to show that second enlightenment, as Gojo, upon realizing he lost in the battle against Sukuna, realizes he's not the strongest. However, since he's in some semblance of heaven with all of his friends, he's finally getting to live as a human. And this corroborated by the fact that all of the people in Gojo's airport scene, heaven scene, are from when Gojo and Geto were still high schoolers, and they were living their best days without even really knowing it. Therefore, one can make the argument that Gojo's death was actually his enlightenment, as his death freed him from the burden of being the strongest, and now he's with all the people he loves. Because here's the thing, while we would love it if Gojo was alive, he has way more dead friends than alive ones. The theory then, once again after this kind of veers, as it says, Nanami said by going north you become anew. Gojo would need to let go of his old identity as the strongest, his powers, to go north. Now, if you hypothetically wanted to tie going north to the Buddhist ideology that Buddha took 7 steps north after his enlightenment, then I guess I could see why we would do a Nanami tie-in here, but I just, for the life of me, can't figure out how what Meimei told Nanami about leaving Japan ties in to Gojo's death. Because what is going north, does that mean enlightenment? I think more than anything that Nanami line pertains to Nanami, as it's supposed to show us that Nanami, when posed with the idea of leaving Japan, immediately chose to go south. As he didn't want to be a new person, he simply wanted to stay himself, but be elsewhere. The theory then continues to say that the signs have been obvious all along, because if you look at the panel that reveals his death in chapter 236, we can see that there's thin lines over his right eye to show that he's losing sight in said eye. But there's none of these lines over his left eye, which I, one, barely see, but 2, if I did see, Gojo gets his right eye cut a bunch of times by Sukuna's cleave and dismantle, which means it's a solid possibility that that eye was just still healing. However, if there is hypothetically lines over this right eye, it's the same right eye that was blacked out during Gojo's last Hollow Purple, and thus the reason that Gojo died was to free him from the burden of the title of the strongest. And through the sacrifice of his right eye and the possible loss of his cursed technique and cursed energy, Gojo will be able to come back and live a healthy and normal life as a human and not as the strongest, and he'll be able to pass down that title of the strongest to the likes of Yuji. Now, I'm gonna admit, there's some moments throughout this theory that make some sense, but genuinely, if you're gonna make the argument that Gojo is gonna lose one of his eyes, I would say that the most compelling evidence actually comes from a different moment in the music video, and that would be when the bisected fish takes a nail to the eye. And since we've already made the narrative connection between Gojo and that fish, why would there be a nail to the eye? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's because Gojo doesn't sacrifice his eye for himself. See, the entirety of this theory is built around the idea that Gojo is trying to shed the burden of the strongest and prop up the new generation. You know who could use a massive amount of reverse curse technique, a miracle, and an eyeball? Nobara. And considering the fact that we've seen reverse curse technique bring people back from the dead immediately after they died, like when Yuta brings Yuji back to life after killing him, wouldn't it make more sense to assume that the symbology of a nail being driven into the eye of Gojo would be Gojo at the end of his life sacrificing what he has left in power to bring back one of his students? Because Gojo has already shed the title of the strongest. It belongs to Sukuna. He killed him in a 1-on-1. Okay, a 3-on-1. A 4-on-1 if you include the fire extinguisher. But now Gojo is living up in airport heaven with the rest of his friends, and he doesn't have to worry about the burden of the strongest. And meanwhile, you know who wasn't in that airport scene? Nobara. Everybody else who's died throughout the duration of Gojo's life was there. Even the principal of Tokyo Shujitsu High, who Gojo didn't even like all that much, was there. Toji was there. But Nobara, one of his students, one of the closest people to Gojo on Earth, wasn't? That's because she's not dead, because immediately after her death, she was put in a form of stasis. And since we already know people who are recently dead can be brought back to life, Gojo's real binding vow was to bring back Nobara. Not only makes more sense from a narrative and plot perspective, as not only is it a direct instance of Gojo propping up the next generation, but if you want to focus on all of the eye symbology, what eye did Nobara lose? That, ladies and gentlemen, would be her left. So if the left eye does truly mark new beginnings in Buddhism, then why wouldn't Gojo's left eye go into saving Nobara? There's a lot of really good things in this theory, but I feel like it misses the mark by like this much. And there's also some points in this theory that straight up just did not need to be added. But overall, pretty good. I give it a 6.8 out of 10. But my theory 10 out of 10. What do you guys think? Do you believe Gojo is coming back? Do you believe Nobara is coming back? Do you believe that believing either of these things is a massive hit of copium and the only reason that I'm trying to find ways to bring Nobara back is because I got a tattoo of her right before I read the part of the manga where she fucking died? Tell me in the comments below. While you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh, we try not to say the F word on this channel. Cody, can we bleep that?